Whenever I'm doing education workshops, a common question that comes up, particularly from scouts, is how can I identify whether somebody is an early or a late maturer? And this is an important question because quite often scouts and often coaches as well will simply be out there watching football or watching a sport, and they might not have that information in terms of growth, developmental status, etc. So being able to tell the difference between a player who may be benefiting from early maturation or a player who may be struggling due to later maturation or may have potentially more growth in the tank is really important. Now, it can be done, there's no doubts about it. If you understand the physical changes that accompany puberty, then you can eyeball a kid and have a pretty good understanding of where they might be in terms of their relative development. Now, when children are growing in childhood, they're largely growing in the extremities, so children grow distal to proximal, so we tend to find that the feet are growing and then the legs are growing, and then during puberty we see most of the growth typically in the upper torso. So a classic sign of a child who has not quite entered puberty yet is they have these big old, almost like clown feet, because the feet have grown very quickly. They've got these long legs that go on forever because of the fact they've been growing in childhood, but they have this comparatively short torso, so it looks like they're all legs at that point of time. That's a classic sign of a kid who has not quite got into puberty yet as well. So it has proportionally longer legs relative to the torso. Other things you would be looking for in boys is that in childhood the face typically is quite round, and as children go through puberty you see a broadening of the cheekbones and a squaring of the jaw. Other classic signs as well is you get that growth in the torso during puberty and a broadening of the shoulder, so you get that kind of classic V shape with the early maturing boys as they go through puberty. And of course the classic signs is in late maturity they're putting on a lot of lean mass. So when you see the player who's got that kind of larger, comparatively larger torso, the broadening of the shoulder, the more manly face, that's going to be a classic sign of a boy who is starting to go through puberty. Other things you might look at as well is changes in voice. So as boys go through puberty, you're going to find that the wee squeaky voice has gone from being squeaky to being a lot deeper. So that's a classic sign. You may see other signs associated with puberty. You may see acne, for example, in some kids as they gain a more greasy complexion. And there's going to be changes in terms of secondary sex characteristics too. So we're going to see the appearance of body hair, and girls are going to be development of breasts, etc. And of course with the girls, they're not going to be broadening across the shoulder, but you're going to see a widening of the hip relative to the shoulder, and increases in terms of fat mass going on at that point of time as well. And so if you know all the kind of signals, you can quite easily go out there and identify which kids are in different stages of their maturation. Really nice example of this was we were down at a bio-banded tournament with Arsenal and Southampton recently, and we had two bio-banded groups playing across the field from one another. The first bio-banded group were 85 to 90% of adult stature, so these are kids who are just starting to go through puberty, really starting to stretch up at this point of time, but they really haven't put the muscle mass on, and you could tell it. You could look at the kids and they look like kids who were starting to grow. In comparison, once you went across the field and you saw the boys who were 91 to 96% of adult stature, that was a completely different kettle of fish. These were boys who hadn't just stretched and grown, but were starting to put on the muscle mass at that point of time. And I know that Southampton and Arsenal got fantastic strength and conditioning programs. The boys were starting to look big and strong at that point of time, and the game was much faster. You could tell the players were much stronger and much more powerful. So it was a case of looking at young men versus young boys just across the two areas, and you could quite easily tell that there were physical differences between this one group and the other group. Likewise, when you go and you look at the boys who might be in the sort of the 80 to 85 group, they're still wee boys at that point of time. They really haven't stretched at that point at all, and you're not seeing any of the early signs of puberty kind of kicking in at that point of time too. So once you understand what you're looking for, there's no doubts about it, you can get a pretty good accurate estimation in terms of where a player is in terms of their biological maturity, and this can be quite useful. I remember a trip down to Southampton a few years back. This was when we first started doing the PMA work, and it was a group of under 15 boys who turned up, and most of the boys fairly early developing, very strong, very muscular. But then this one lad turned up out of the blue, and he was the tallest of the lot of them, but he looked like Bambi on ice. He had these long legs that went on forever, comparatively short torso, no real lean mass. And when you looked at his face as well, it was just a wee round face. He looked like he had a wee boy's face. But as I said, he was the tallest of the lot of them. He was about 5'11". And I remember saying to Sam Scott at Southampton, I says, that kid's going to be huge. You know, that kid has not hit through puberty yet, and he's going to be pretty tall in the long term. And right enough, I think, remember chatting with Sam later on, the kid had ended up being about 6'4", 6'5". And by knowing that, knowing kind of what you're looking for, you can see those athletes who maybe got a little bit more further potential in terms of the growth and development. Definitely worth looking at. And there is a study, I believe, in Switzerland which actually looked at coaches being able to identify early on time and late maturity. And with that kind of information, they can do it quite accurately.